and that of the Jefferson School of Leadership Studies are delighted that we can join with Tredegar to present this program to you tonight. This program we think, is very congruent with the mission of all three organizations. And I think we'll all enjoy an exciting, interesting program tonight. Thank you very much for being here. And I'd like to introduce Alex Wise, the president of Tredegar, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. On behalf of the board and staff of the Tredegar National Civil War Center Foundation, let me say how delighted we are to be able to work with the Jefferson School of Leadership Studies and Leadership Metro Richmond to bring you tonight's extraordinary program. And actually, this is a designer program. It's tailor-made. It hasn't been done before, so this is part of why it's so exciting. What should I do with this? Kill it? Can you hear me? Does that work all right?
Turn ours on.
The Foundation's mission is to tell the whole story of the conflict that still shapes our nation. To do that, we are planning a new interpretive and learning center in Richmond's Tredegar Iron Works that will examine the war's causes, course, and legacies from Union, African American, and Confederate perspectives. The center will be unique. It will tell everybody's story, and it will be here at ground zero of the cataclysm that shaped modern America. Our hope is that tonight's program will be useful to you as leaders in at least two ways. First, leading well requires understanding the dynamics behind appearances. Why are Richmond and our nation as they are? It could be said that modern America was born the moment Abraham Lincoln combined his war for union with Frederick Douglass's war for freedom to gain the upper hand on Jefferson Davis's war for independence. The dynamics of those three wars are still at work today here at Ground Zero and elsewhere across the nation. Understanding the worldviews and decisions of Lincoln, Douglass, and Davis will help you as leaders understand the dynamics still at work today. Second, we can learn much about leadership by considering how leaders act under stress. Lincoln, Douglass, and Davis functioned during the gravest crisis our nation has ever witnessed. Lincoln and Davis led their respective countries, and Douglass felt the heavy responsibility of leading a people in search of a country. By examining the challenges, strategies, qualities, successes, and failures of these three leaders, we can learn much. We are fortunate to have a trio of extraordinary minds to lead us. Harold Holtzer was unable to join us tonight, but in his stead, to speak about Lincoln, we are pleased to have with us one of America's outstanding Lincoln scholars, Michael Holt.
Liar, liar.
Professor Holt is the Langford Williams Professor of History at the University of Virginia, author of several outstanding books. His most recent is his monumental The Rise and Fall of the American Whig Party, Jacksonian Politics and the Onset of the which won second prize in the 1999 Lincoln Prize competition. Professor Holt is also co-author with David Donald of the classic text, The Civil War and Reconstruction. David W. Blight, in the middle, is our expert on Frederick Douglass. For many years, Professor Blight taught at Amherst College, and he is now teaching at Yale University. His most recent book is Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, which won both the Lincoln and Douglass prizes 2 years ago. You may have seen him recently on the PBS series Reconstruction. He is a member of Tredegar's National Advisory Board. William J. Cooper, Jr., on the end, is our expert on Jefferson Davis. He is the Boyd Professor of History at Louisiana State University. Dr. Cooper's most recent book is the magisterial Jefferson Davis American, which he completed while serving as the Douglas Southall Freeman Professor, visiting professor at the University of Richmond. He is a trustee of the Museum of the Confederacy and a member of Tredegar's National Advisory Board. We hope you will all benefit in your own development as leaders, whether young or old, from the opportunity to hear and interact with these wonderful scholars. We'll hear from them in the order of Lincoln, Douglass, and Davis. Mike? You've got it.
I guess, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is on. Let me share what I consider an irony with you. Exactly 1 week ago today, I was out in Springfield, Illinois, giving a paper at the annual meeting of the Abraham Lincoln Association, which always has a symposium on Lincoln's birthday. And in that paper, I managed to say nothing about Abraham Lincoln. And I find it ironic that I come to Richmond to talk about Lincoln. I am not a renowned Lincoln scholar. I do know something about the Civil War and a lot about 19th century political history, but I'm not a biographer of Lincoln in any sense, like my mentor David Donald was. We've been given 15 minutes apiece, and therefore I'm going to read a text. It's more efficient if it's not as audience friendly. Historians almost universally rank Abraham Lincoln as our nation's greatest president. One reason for this, of course, is that he served during the nation's gravest crisis. But there are other reasons, and among the aspects of his leadership that are usually cited to justify this ranking are first, his supreme eloquence in defining the purpose and meaning of the Union's war effort in the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural, among other documents. Second, the superb political skill he demonstrated in holding the Union together long enough for its military forces to win the war. Third, his steadfast determination to carry on in the face of repeated disappointments on the battlefield and personal tragedies. Fourth, his magnanimity toward his Confederate foes. And fifth, his role, though historians hotly debate this, in securing the emancipation of the slaves. Yet many historians also cite as evidence of his greatness as a leader his capacity for growth, his ability to become wiser, more eloquent, and more sure-footed the longer he served as president. This argument for growth, for personal growth in office, of course, raises the question of growth from what base? That is, when was Lincoln not so great when it mattered to the nation what he did? And I told somebody before this lecture, Matt Erskine, I think, in some ways I've come to bury Caesar, not to praise him in these remarks. My answer of when Lincoln was not so great would be during the secession crisis that erupted immediately after Lincoln's election on November 6, 1860, and lasted until the firing on Fort Sumter 5 weeks after Lincoln's inauguration in March. Those days, I think, constituted Lincoln's worst rather than his final hour, and I think they pay investigation not to see what he did that was right, but to try to figure out what he did that was wrong and why he did it. That is, this is things leaders shouldn't do, in my mind. In a letter to the president-elect dated December 31st, 1860, an obscure resident of Belleville, Ohio, outlined with exemplary precision and concision the choices facing Lincoln during the secession crisis as president-elect. And this is a quote. "This is not the time for a public man to think more about his party than his country. The integrity of the Republican Party must be held in subordination to the integrity of the Union. If either must perish, the choice of the patriot is easy." What this writer and scores of others who wrote Lincoln before his inauguration, Republicans and non-Republicans, Southerners as well as Northerners, wanted Lincoln to do before he was inaugurated. And remember, inaugurations in that period were not until March 4th. It was 4 full months before Lincoln would take over, was to reach out to and reassure Southerners, especially Southern opponents of immediate secession in the Upper South, in order to slow, if not completely to diffuse, the secession mania roaring across the South with a speed that Lincoln never fully comprehended. There were 3 means by which Lincoln might have reached out to the South before his inauguration: in the construction of his cabinet, in the issuance of public statements denying any hostility to slavery and Southerners, and in support for attempts at compromise, especially on the question of slavery extension in Congress that winter. I believe, and so does William W. Freeling, the leading authority on Southern secession who now lives in Charlottesville, that had Lincoln made these overtures, he could in fact have prevented secession in the Upper South, and probably, according to Bill Freeling, the secession of Georgia and Louisiana as well. Nothing would have stopped the madmen in South Carolina. Yet on each a score of the things that Lincoln might possibly do, Lincoln put preserving the Republican Party ahead of preserving the Union. One can only speculate why he did so. A misunderstanding of the seriousness of the secession movement, sheer inexperience, and or a lack of self-confidence when dealing with more prominent Republican leaders who demanded that he yield nothing to the South. Lincoln, after all, was not a prominent national leader of the Republican Party. He'd gotten the nomination as a anybody but Seward movement. People who didn't want Seward nominated rallied behind Lincoln, but he was not a prominent Republican leader. But to give you one example of what some of these more prominent leaders wanted, who demanded that he yield nothing to the South, the radical South-bashing Republican Senator Zachariah Chandler of Michigan wrote Illinois' Republican Senator Lyman Trumbull on November 15th, 1860. This is a full month before even South Carolina secedes. This is a week after the election was November 6th. This is what he wrote. "I trust Mr. Lincoln's nerves are not disturbed by this disunion howl. It is almost music to my ears. I will not say that I desire them to commit open absolute treason, but as God is my judge, I would rather see every traitor in South Carolina hanged and Charleston burned than to see Mr. Lincoln appease them in advance of his inaugural." Then Chandler added an incredible postscript. "Individually, I do want a little shooting or hanging done before this matter is ended, if we have a decent excuse for it." Chandler represented the hardcore of the decidedly anti-Southern Republican Party as it existed in 1860. Yet many other prominent Republicans gave Lincoln the opposite advice. They urged him to reach out to Southerners by one means or another. Nonetheless, prior to his inauguration, Lincoln, mistakenly in my opinion, sided with the hardcore. Take the construction of Lincoln's cabinet, for example. Within days of his election, some Republicans strongly urged Lincoln to appoint non-Republican Southerners to his cabinet. The original justification was to create what were called working majorities in the first Congress to sit after Lincoln's inauguration, for in 1860 Republicans had failed to win a majority of seats in the House, let alone the Senate. But as the secession crisis deepened, as it did very quickly, conciliating the South became the main reason to appoint non-Republican Southerners to the cabinet. The point these men repeatedly stressed was to appoint only Southerners who had never been previously affiliated with the Republican Party. Some of his correspondents suggested the Kentucky Democrat Joseph Holt, who's no relation of mine, as Secretary of War after he had displayed backbone in that position during the final months of James Buchanan's administration. And given the disaster that Simon Cameron proved to be, it's clear in hindsight that Lincoln should have heeded this advice. But far more Republicans urged Lincoln to ignore the tiny Republican Party in the slave states and appoint only former Whigs who'd supported John Bell's constitutional union presidential candidacy. What's more, they were exceptionally specific, if not to the names of who should be appointed, to the numbers of Southerners that should be appointed. Lincoln, Republicans as prominent as David Davis, who'd been Lincoln's campaign manager in 1860, John DeFreeze, the leading Republican editor and erstwhile Whig state chairman of Indiana, and William Henry Seward, Lincoln's selection as Secretary of State, told him repeatedly that he must appoint at least 3 non-Republican Southerners to his cabinet to appease the South. Indeed, Lincoln, through an intermediary, Lincoln Sweat, explicitly told Lincoln not to select, quote, the leaders of little factions in our party with a view to consolidate and fairly represent all elements of our party, unquote. Instead, Lincoln should seek a complete union of all patriotic men, exactly what opponents of secession in the Upper South were telling Lincoln at precisely the same time. Yet Lincoln repeatedly complained that he could never find any Southerners that agreed with his positions on slavery. And his correspondents responded, that's precisely the point. You've got to appoint men who are known publicly to disagree with your position on slavery. That's the only way to save the Union. Lincoln finally said, I'll never appoint 3. The party will repudiate me. I'll go after only 1. And as is well known, he made half-hearted and unsuccessful attempts to recruit North Carolina's John A. Gilmer or Virginia's Robert E. Scott. In the end, Lincoln appointed only 2 men from slave states to his cabinet, both of whom were considered good Republicans in the North. In this chance for outreach to the South, in some, Lincoln blew it, largely one suspects because he was far more concerned with balancing the elements of the Republican Party, just what Seward told him not to do, explicitly told him not to do, than with reaching beyond the Republican Party. And for those of you who don't know, the Republican Party was exclusively Northern. There were no Southerners in the Republican Party. There were no Lincoln ballots in most slave states in 1860. The same can be said for Lincoln's utter refusal to issue any public statements prior to his inaugural about how he would deal with slavery in the South once he became president, as scores of his correspondents begged. Lincoln justified his resolute silence with interesting arguments. He would, he wrote, appear timid and irresolute if he caved into such demands. In short, he dared not cross the hardliners in the Republican Party. But he also said, perhaps correctly, that Southern newspapers would ignore, refuse to print, or distort anything, any public statement he made to reassure Southerners. And here we get at an aspect of leadership, and especially of national political leadership, that is too often forgotten. The ability of a leader to communicate directly and accurately with a suspicious or hostile audience. Lincoln assuredly had the ability to communicate clearly and effectively. But in an age without radio or television, how could he have possibly gotten the word out accurately if Southern editors were intent on distorting it for their readership? Of all Lincoln's mistakes during the secession crisis, this refusal to say anything before his inaugural address strikes me as the most reasonable. Lincoln's refusal to support attempts at compromise in Congress prior to his inauguration strikes me as far less reasonable. Lincoln, to be sure, did not oppose all concessions to the South. As is well known by scholars of the Civil War period, but may be a big surprise to many people in this room, the Congress that met in the winter of 1860-61 passed by the necessary two-thirds majorities and sent to the states for ratification a proposed 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution that would have forever prohibited the United States government from abolishing slavery in the South. This is one of the great ironies given what becomes the real 13th Amendment. This would have forever prohibited the national government from abolishing slavery. What is less well known, but absolutely clear from a perusal of Lincoln's correspondence during the secession winter of 1860-61, is that Lincoln personally was the author of this constitutional amendment, although many other Republicans also seized on it. But the sticking point for any congressional compromise was not slavery's abolition where it existed. Rather, the real problem was slavery's potential extension into Western territories, and specifically the sticking point on was whether or not to extend the now repealed Missouri Compromise line to California. That line barred slavery north of it, the so-called 3630 line, but allowed without specifically legalizing slavery south of it. Many Republicans in and outside Congress believed this a perfectly reasonable concession to the South. Lincoln, as is again well known, demanded that congressional Republicans reject such a concession. His stated rationale was that it would invite Southerners to demand future territorial acquisitions, that it would allow slavery extension, although how that could have happened with a Republican president is beyond me. And many of his Republican correspondents told him that there were ways to stop that. Arguments that, again, seem to me, with hindsight, quite persuasive. But the indisputable fact is that Lincoln killed attempts at congressional compromise, largely, one suspects, because he put the demands of his party's hardliners ahead of the integrity of the Union. I must ignore Lincoln's tribulations over Fort Sumter once he became president, largely because of pressures on my time, which is running perilously short if I've not already gone beyond it. But I personally believed, and without any smoking gun in a letter or reported conversation from Lincoln, that after Fort Sumter, he profoundly regretted the choices he had made during the secession crisis to put the integrity of the Republican Party ahead of the integrity of the Union. From that point on, I think, he clearly put the welfare of the Union ahead of the welfare of the Republican Party, and that it was his profound desire to reconcile with white Southerners now supporting the Confederacy that explains much of what he did during the Civil War, and that especially explains his disagreement with the South-hating, bloodlusting Republican majority in Congress over emancipation, confiscation, the use of black troops, and Reconstruction policy. I also believe that it was precisely Lincoln's determination to put Union ahead of party that explains why historians should rate him our best president. Now, to back up these assertions, I could point to many things, but in the few minutes that remain to me, again, if I still have any, I want to turn to Lincoln and emancipation, which, as I said, has been a subject of some dispute among historians. The dispute was once over the question of whether Lincoln was an eager or a reluctant emancipator. Over the last 20 years, however, a new interpretation contends that slaves, in fact, emancipated themselves by running away to Union Army lines during the Civil War, and that the very numbers of these fugitive slaves forced first congressional Republicans and then Lincoln to adopt emancipation as government policy. Here, in short, African Americans on the ground in the South, not policy makers in Washington, deserve the credit for ending slavery. Let me finish by trying to respond briefly to this dispute. I would insist, as do others, that the central question here on Lincoln and emancipation is not what Lincoln's attitudes towards blacks or what his racial views were, which in fact can be read in a number of ways. Rather, the central issue is what Lincoln thought about slavery and what his priorities were during the Civil War. There's absolutely no doubt that personally, Lincoln utterly abhorred slavery as a moral, economic, and political blight, a hideous stain that Lincoln hoped would one day be erased from the escutcheon of the American Republic, and he was willing to wait a long time for this. To my mind, Lincoln put far more importance on the restoration of the Union than on the end of slavery. In his inaugural address in March 1861, he expressed his approval of the proposed 13th Amendment, sparing slavery forever from federal abolition, although he did not acknowledge his authorship of that amendment. Then, until September 22, 1862, the day he issued his famous preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln publicly and privately resisted every attempt by Congress, Republicans outside of Congress, and military commanders in the field to emancipate slaves, and especially to enroll blacks in the Union Army. Indeed, he went out of his way in the summer of 1862 to say that these were not his aims. Primarily, it seems clear, in order to hold Northern Democrats and residents of the border slave states who hated the idea of emancipation and the use of black troops behind the North's war effort to restore the Union. The repulse of George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac outside Richmond, and here we are on sacred ground, or important ground, in late June 1862, clearly changed Lincoln's mind. The 7 Days Battle, it seems to me, rather than Antietam or Gettysburg, was clearly the single most important turning point of the Civil War. To defeat the Confederacy militarily, Lincoln now realized, it must be stripped of the labor power supplied by black slaves that allowed an extraordinary percentage of white men in the South to serve in Confederate armies. Better yet, Lincoln later realized, and I believe he reached this conclusion only in 1863, enrolling Southern blacks as Union Army troops could help win the war. But, and I wanted to stress this in conclusion, Lincoln's preliminary announcement of impending emancipation on September 22nd, when he said, as of January 1st, 1863, there'll be emancipation, was in fact decidedly preliminary. He made it emphatically clear in that document that any Confederate states or parts of states that returned to the Union prior to January 1863 would be exempted from emancipation. That is, he was trying to leverage Confederate states to give up before he had to emancipate. And I think he would have been delighted if that had been the outcome. In short, I firmly believe restoration of the Union rather than emancipation remained his primary goal. We know, in fact, that between September 22, 1862 and January 1, 1863, Lincoln repeatedly and explicitly wrote Union Army commanders and civil governors in occupied areas of the Confederacy to hold congressional elections as quickly as possible, electing as many men as possible to the United States Congress in Washington, precisely so he could exempt those areas from emancipation. After January 1st, 1863, however, Lincoln never, ever faltered on his commitment to emancipation. And some of his most sublime language comes in letters justifying it and his commitment to it, in his refusal to betray that commitment. That is one reason why historians rank him as our greatest presidential leader, but he has my vote for a somewhat different reason. During the secession crisis, as president-elect, Lincoln put the needs of the Republican Party ahead of the needs of the Union. With the firing on Fort Sumter, I believe he clearly reversed his priorities. And it was precisely that reversal, to put the nation ahead of his party, that justifies ranking Lincoln as our greatest president. Thank you.
My mic on? We're on. Thank you, Alex, and thank you also to the Jefferson School of Leadership. It's a great honor to be part of this panel and to address such a discerning audience as is clearly here this evening. I'm glad Michael didn't give us the perfect Abraham Lincoln, because if I then came along and gave us a praiseworthy Frederick Douglass, poor Bill would be left as the vanquished to deal with these two victors, and that wouldn't be fair. And I'll try to make sure there's a wart or two on Frederick Douglass, if I can. Frederick Douglass never fired a musket in the Civil War. He never drew a sword. He never suffered dysentery in the trenches at Petersburg. And he never even heard a shot fired in anger. He was never an elected official. But from the immense tragedy of those who did all of those things, and over the long haul of American history, Douglass has had much to do and much to say with the meaning of that great event. I had a great taxi driver on the way here today from the airport, an African-American gentleman whose last name was Southall. And I resisted all the way here asking if he was any relation to Douglas Southall Freeman. I didn't ask him. I did not ask him. We had a great talk. He said, "What are you doing at Richmond, University of Richmond?" I'm on a panel about Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, and Frederick Douglass. He said something to the effect of, "I never would have thought those three would be in the same panel." And I said, "Well, things are changing. You know, Lincoln's there on the James River now, and you never know when Douglass might appear in Richmond." Douglass didn't serve on the battlefield, but he had served in slavery. He had served on countless abolitionist platforms, and he had written some of the most enduring anti-slavery literature, especially those first two autobiographies, those classics, and many great speeches, notably his 1852 4th of July speech, which I think is the rhetorical masterpiece of American abolitionism. He had served by recruiting black soldiers, about 100 members of the 54th Massachusetts, 2 of which were his sons. And he had served in so many other ways to try to change or shape the emancipation policy of Lincoln's administration, which, as Michael has said, grew with time. And Frederick Douglass retreated to no Walden Ponds for his civil disobedience. To Douglass, the American Civil War, once it finally came, and he welcomed disunion and war, make no mistake, was about some very large questions. Slavery or freedom in an expanding republic. It was about whether black people would even have a future in this land. It was about the dream of human dignity, recognized without conditions. The achievement of, for himself, certainly, a secure social identity in the place of his birthplace. For him personally, and to an extent, it was probably about personal vengeance and retribution against slavery and against slaveholders. An idea I'll come back to in a moment as part of his leadership. The war was about the rending and destruction of an old Union, flawed and crippled, in Douglass's view, and the creation of a new and redefined republic, a second American Revolution. It was about the strange abstraction we all call freedom, what Abraham Lincoln referred to in the second inaugural as that result, so fundamental and astounding, the result of black freedom. Douglass's war was more, if you like, of an intellectual and a spiritual experience than a physical test. In 1878, after the war, reacting to the growing appeal of monument building and veterans reunions and the increasing appeal of the Confederate lost cause, Douglass declared that the Civil War was, quote, in his words, not a fight between rapacious birds and ferocious beasts, a mere display of brute courage and endurance, but it was a war, he said, between men of thought as well as of action, and in dead earnest for something beyond the battlefield. Now, I want to speak for just a couple of minutes on this question of the unique nature of black leadership, especially in the 19th century, but I think we'll see echoes of this well into the 20th century. I want to basically make 3 points about this. The first is that black leadership in the 19th century, and you all can see with me how this lasted through time, has always been about the problem of constituency and legitimacy. A black leader had no access in the at least before the Civil War, to elective office until Reconstruction. A leader, therefore, had to be some combination of activist or reformist or revolutionary. There was no elective sanction to be had, even for this greatest of black leaders, Douglass. Our session tonight is on the theme of crisis. Well, black leaders in the 19th century were always in crisis. They were always in crisis in slave America and always in crisis in Jim Crow America. Crisis became, as many of you will know, the title of the magazine of the NAACP from 1909 on, which still exists and is still called The Crisis. But how to affect real power? This was the dilemma of black leadership in the 19th century. How to bend ideological and political wills of white people who controlled America. The crisis was whether African Americans had a future at all in the United States, or now the not-so-United States. A second point is that there's always been a problem in the way we study black leadership between these two concepts of leadership and achievement. These can be different, as many of you would know. Leadership often involves some kind of programmatic sense, some programmatic leadership, some kind of political or social agenda that a leader is trying to advance on behalf of a group of people, a cause. Achievement often, and I'm not diminishing it by any means, is not always the same thing as leadership. In achievement, one might think of Madam C.J. Walker, Jack Johnson, Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, in athletics, and 1,000 other examples. In the arts and writing, Langston Hughes, Toni Morrison, and that litany could go on and on. Great achievement. But is it leadership in the way we may be talking about it? It might, or it might not be. And a third point I'd make about black leadership in the 19th century is that it was always, I think, uniquely, a predicament of caste, C-A-S-T-E, and not merely or only of race. A caste means, and here in the American sense, I'm using it, not in the subcontinent Indian sense necessarily, but it means a special or persistent subjugation of a group. Black leaders were always the leaders in the 19th century, surely, and certainly in the era of Jim Crow, of a caste in American society. A people set apart, a people defined out of the polity and out of normal modes of developing social status, at least in the larger society. This becomes a determinant of the styles and the strategies of black leadership. Caste does not or did not lend itself to coalition building. Nobody in power needed to court the votes of people who couldn't vote. Nobody needed to court the allegiance of people who had no role in politics. Who needed to court Frederick Douglass for his constituency? Except in national crisis, except in circumstances of moral imperative, and except under the necessity sometimes of events. And that gets Frederick Douglass invited to the White House during the Civil War twice, actually, and then a third time to celebrate Lincoln's second inaugural. The last point about black leadership generally, and then I want to come back to Douglass in my remaining time. The key characteristics, it might be said, of 19th century black leadership, and therefore of Frederick Douglass in his overall dilemma as a black leader, were these. He did not derive his power from a democratic source. It did not come out of elective sanction. There were urgings he received, after the war in particular, to go south and get himself elected to the U.S. Congress, say in Mississippi. It would have been surely possible. What a senator Frederick Douglass would have made. Maybe, as long as he may have lasted in the politics of Reconstruction. There are reasons why he didn't. We might come back to that later. Secondly, he had to be, as all black leaders did, and he's, of course, not alone here. Douglass wasn't the only black leader in the 19th century. He had to be a self-styled exemplar, if you like, a credit to his race, always representing his race as some kind of measure of capacity, capability, achievement, or whatever. And thirdly, his position was always tenuous, always vulnerable, and lacking normal standards of political legitimacy. Now, Douglass and the crisis of slavery, secession, the Union, the war, emancipation, and all the other great issues of the Civil War. First of all, the single greatest characteristic you could argue about 19th century black leadership, and I think it's true right on through the 20th century, even to this very day, even though we now have hundreds and hundreds of black elected officials, is that by and large, throughout American history, African-American leadership has been a leadership essentially of language, of persuasion, of the power and the weapon of words, because so often it was the only power that a black leader truly had access to. And that Douglass was such a genius with language, such a powerful wielder of words, part of which for him comes from mystery, a gift, and part of which comes from hard work, training, and reading. Douglass is perhaps the greatest example we've ever had until, well, maybe Du Bois, and then certainly Martin Luther King, and a few others we could name, who was a leader by words, by language. We will always know Douglass, largely, in his language. That's not untrue, of course, of Abraham Lincoln as well. Jim McPherson once wrote a lovely little essay entitled, How Abraham Lincoln Won the War with Metaphors. And, of course, literally speaking, not too many metaphors have ever won a war, but I think you know what McPherson was after there. Well, one could write the same piece, in fact, that's not a bad idea, of how Frederick Douglass won the war, maybe in the long run, in metaphor. But think for just a moment with me how important language was to a slave. Language was literally, well, almost literally, a form of freedom. When a slave could escape from slavery, by whatever means, by his or her own wits, by some kind of help from some network of people who helped fugitive slaves, by writing his own pass and borrowing sailors' papers and borrowing some money from his fiancée who sold her feather bed to get him some money, which is the way Douglass got out of slavery, and wrote his own pass, language literally became a way to freedom. Once he was free but still a fugitive slave, how did Douglass live? He lived by language. He lived as an orator. For giving his first abolitionist speech on Nantucket Island in August of 1841, where he says he quailed in his boots as he got up to speak for the first time in his life before white people. And lo and behold, he could do it. God, he could do it well. And William Lloyd Garrison hired him and sent him out on the road for the next 3.5 years, where he gave hundreds of speeches, basically telling his story of his life as a slave, and he became Exhibit A on the abolitionist circuit. He lived by language. He led by language. Language was his power. Then he writes his first autobiography, which he couldn't even keep in print. It was so popular. He goes to England for 2 years. He could hardly keep enough copies in his hands. Everywhere he would go, he would sell his narrative. And he ends up speaking to audiences of thousands of people. One time in London, he spoke to 10,000 people in 1847. Language has power. Especially, last point on this, in a world that defined humanity in the 19th century, that really defined one's humanity by those people with written language. If you could tell your story, especially write it up, you were part of the human family. If you weren't, the world judged at that time, you didn't have a history. The slave who could write became human and gained an element, at least, of power. How did Douglass use that power? And I could go on and on about the significance of language to Douglass. I really shouldn't, because I'd run out of time. Oh, one quote, just one. He was a great student of oratory. As you may know, he was not only a great orator, and his oratorical career spanned 54 years, but he was a great student of oratory. It began in that little book he bartered for as a 12-year-old slave called The Columbian Orator, which was a manual of oratory. The only possession he carried out of slavery with him, except the clothes on his back, was his copy of The Columbian Orator, published in 1797. Douglass said that he believed the great orator had to have what he called moral heroism. An interesting term. He said he had to have moral heroism on his side. Thus armed, said Douglass, I quote him, thus armed, a worm can thrash a mountain. Speech, the live, calm, grave, clear, pointed, warm, sweet, melodious, and powerful human voice is the chosen instrumentality of humanity. Douglass used too many adjectives there. I would cut out the word if I were correcting this, but I'm not going to correct it. An example. In the war, what did Douglass become? Well, he was already an editor, of course, of his own newspaper, which he will stop publishing in August of 1863 for a variety of reasons. What could a black leader do as the Civil War breaks out? And all over black America, black folk are hoping, are yearning, those guns fired in Fort Sumter and those guns fired at Bull Run and those guns fired the rest of that summer in West Virginia and other places are going to be guns of black freedom. They have their own militia marching all over northern towns and cities, begging the federal government to let them enlist, which the Lincoln administration, of course, does not in 1861 and throughout most of 1862. What does a black leader do? He did the natural thing, I think. He became a thumping and sometimes linguistically violent war propagandist. He began to create the hated enemy. What is war propaganda? But helping a populace understand why they must defeat and kill an enemy. To whip up war fever and to create a war psychology is what Douglass tried to do with his editorials, month after month after month, and with his many speeches. The style and content of his rhetoric became brutal at times, like any other war propaganda you'll read in any other American war. He called Southerners, particularly slaveholders, and he often called the Civil War the Slaveholders' Rebellion. There are lots of names we give the Civil War, as everybody knows, and everybody has their favorite. My own favorite is the late unpleasantness. It's always been my favorite. Douglass's label was the Slaveholders' Rebellion. He called slaveholders barbarians. He called them monsters. Northerners needed to learn, he said, to hate slaveholders, his words, in order to win. When they learned, he said, the, quote, quenchless fire of a deadly hate, they would achieve military victory. He appealed to vengeance and retribution, especially in those recruiting speeches when he was out on the hustings recruiting black men to join the Union Army. He tried to use hatred as a creative force. It was a struggle for the hearts and minds in an all-out civil war. Every war has it. Every nation does it on all sides. Let the grim visage of a northern army confront the slaveholders from one direction, Douglass said. A furious slave insurrection meet them at another, and starvation threaten them from still another. These are not pleasing words. He's not pulling any punches. There were perhaps some deeply personal roots to Douglass's war propaganda in the midst of the Civil War. There was perhaps deep inside of himself still a rage against his own experience under 3 slave owners during the 20 years he served as a slave. I went to the autobiographies back when I was writing my own intellectual biography of Douglass some time ago, and sort of reread particularly the first autobiography looking for this. And one way to read Douglass's autobiographies is that they are portraits of the slaveholder's mind. It's a major theme in his autobiographical writing. He was 27 years a slave and a fugitive slave. That was his formative experience. And now the war unleashed him to make war, rhetorically at least, on slaveholders, and he did. Slavery had taught Frederick Douglass about the uses of violence, it had taught him about the uses of dehumanization, and it had taught him how to hate. And the war allowed him to do it. Now in the midst of a sanctioned, legal, official war on the South, Douglass's own personal rage, perhaps, was unleashed. The only penetrable point of a tyrant, wrote Douglass in 1861, is the fear of death. The outcry that they make as to the danger of having their throats cut is because they deserve to have them cut. The same man who was such a source of love, compassion, and deep enlightenment humanism, who had answered so many rebukes with reason and logic rather than anger and violence, could also speak those words. This tells us something about what war unleashes in the human psyche. It reminds us that the creation of a hated enemy is one of those recurrent, tragic exigencies of war. To deny this darker side of Douglass and his wartime rhetoric might be to deny an element of his own humanity. Now, lastly, I think I have just a minute or two. I want to just end with one other example, and it brings us back to Lincoln and Douglass, I hope. Michael mentioned that Lincoln grew in the presidency, especially on this question of emancipation, and I completely agree with that. And I wanted to cite one little comparison or example, maybe two. On December 8, 1863, December now, 63, this is well after the Emancipation Proclamation, we're well into the process of the recruitment of black soldiers, spring, summer, 1863, after Gettysburg and Vicksburg and so forth. On December 8, 1863, Lincoln delivered his annual message, the State of the Union, to Congress. Lincoln still labeled the war in limited terms at that point, calling it what he called an inexcusable insurrection. But the last 5 pages of that annual message demonstrate Lincoln's understanding of the revolutionary turn in the character of the war. Recounting the past year, the policy of emancipation and of employing black soldiers, Lincoln declared, these are his words, gave to the future a new aspect about which hope and fear and doubt contended in uncertain conflict. Lincoln wrote admiringly of the 100,000, his words, slaves at the beginning of the rebellion, now in the United States military service. Emancipation, said the president, had turned the nation's great trial, his words, into its new reckoning, and had made the cause of the Union and, quote, the cause of the Union and a total revolution of labor throughout the whole states one and the same. In the last lines of Lincoln's message, he stressed the iron necessity of what he called the war power, his presidential war power, and paid tribute to the soldiers to whom, as he put it, the world must stand indebted for the home of freedom, his words now, disenthralled, regenerated, enlarged, and perpetuated. At the beginning of the war, Frederick Douglass dreamed of hearing Lincoln say those words, prayed that Lincoln might say those words, and had rehearsed 1,000 times over, writing them for him. Lincoln's language makes a striking comparison to a speech Douglass wrote sometime late that same fall and delivered many times, countless times, throughout that winter and into the whole next year, a speech he called The Mission of the War. Douglass summed up more than 2 years of his war propaganda, his sense of the Civil War as America's sort of cleansing tragedy and bloody rebirth. However long, Douglass's words, the shadow of death cast over the land, however ugly the weeds of mourning, Americans should not forget, he said, the moral grandeur of the war's mission. What we now want is a country, said Douglass, a free country, a country not saddened by the footprints of a single slave and nowhere cursed by the presence of a slaveholder. We want a country which shall not brand the Declaration of Independence as a lie. The dreamer, calling men to die for grand ideas, drew upon one of the deepest strains in American mission. It is the manifest destiny of this war, cried Douglass, to his words, to unify and reorganize the institutions of the country and thereby give the scale of death its sacred significance. The mission of this war, Douglass concluded, is national regeneration. It's the same word Lincoln had used, regeneration. Douglass spoke as though he and Lincoln were now practicing from the same script, albeit one of them with the restrained tones of official state papers, and the other, perhaps in the fiery tones of a prophet. One spoke almost always with an eye on the fickleness of public opinion, and he had to. And the other, as though he were the national evangelist carrying the battle hymn of the Republic to that public in literal terms. Between them, Lincoln and Douglass, if you like, provided the subjunctive and the declarative voices of the Second American Revolution at its inception. This revolutionary, regenerative conception of the war launched black freedom and future equality on its marvelous but always endangered career in American history. All future discussion of the meaning and memory of this fundamental turning point in American history had to either confront or deflect the words, the laws, and the social realities that the war had wrought by the end of 1863. But words alone, whether in metaphor or not, did not give the nation its potential rebirth. To borrow from the word master supreme, Walt Whitman, perhaps it was the dead, the dead, the dead, our dead, or South, or North, ours all, that remade America. Thank you.
Well, I too am delighted to be here this evening, though I must confess, sometimes I wonder why I'm here. I mean, after all, Jefferson Davis lost, and he lost in a very fundamental fashion, in a very decisive fashion. And Americans don't think of leaders as losers. If you lose, you have not led. Top of that, you've got Abraham Lincoln, who was, as I fully agree with Michael, the greatest president this country's ever had. He won. You've got Frederick Douglass, who had a unique role to play in a great revolution taking place in the 19th century. And And though Douglass certainly had his setbacks and his sadnesses, he was at the forefront of something that was fundamental in this country. Jefferson Davis, in many ways, was the wrong side of everything. And yet Jefferson Davis was just as committed to his cause as Lincoln was to his, as Douglass was to his. And what I want to talk about this evening is Davis and his cause, how he handled it, how he confronted the crisis that he faced as President of the Confederacy. And to say crisis, even from the day Davis took the oath of office in Montgomery in February of 1861 until he was captured in South Georgia, May the 10th, 1865, there was nothing but crisis. Uppercase C, uppercase R, uppercase I, uppercase S, uppercase S, every single day. Every single day. I think looking at Davis is worthwhile because this was a man who was put in a position of leadership. And this was a man who had to face crisis every day. How did he do it? He ultimately failed, to be sure. But how did he face this crisis? And how did he go about dealing with what happened to him and to his country? Now, Davis became provisional president of the Confederate States of America on February the 18th, 1861, in the midst, as both my predecessors have said, of the greatest crisis the country had ever faced. The United States that had been created in the American Revolution had broken apart. Following the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860, Southern states began seriously to consider secession, to leave the Union. Between December of 1860 and February of 1861, 7 states of the Deep South, from South Carolina westward to Texas, left the Union. In February, delegates from those states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a government for a new nation, which they called the Confederate States of America. They borrowed much from the old Union and from the old Constitution. Of course, they believed they were the true inheritors of the old Union. They believed that they interpreted the old Constitution properly. But amongst their borrowings was an executive branch headed by a single president. And the delegates in Montgomery named Jefferson Davis of Mississippi president. He was provisional president. This group in Montgomery only named him for 1 year because, of course, this was democratic polity and there would have to be an election. And there was an election held in November of 1861 because you had to have an elected president. Now, Davis ran in 1861 along with his vice president, Alexander Stephens of Georgia. They were chosen unanimously. There was no opposition. Of course, a war was on, which precluded opposition, at least that early in the war. And Davis was chosen for a 6-year term. That's one thing the Confederate Constitution differed. The president would serve for 6 years, not 4, but he could not be reelected. Confederates thought reelection was simply political bargaining and log rolling. They thought they would have more statesmanship if reelection was barred. Now, I've already said that Davis's entire presidency was a crisis. And what I want to do is look at this presidency and look at several elements within it and how Davis addressed those elements and how he came to terms with the country he led and the people he saw out there that he was trying to guide toward independence. Now, Davis is often compared as a war president with Abraham Lincoln, and usually quite unfavorably. But in many ways, it seems to me the more appropriate comparison, though I'm not going to make it directly this evening, the more appropriate comparison is with George Washington. Because both Washington and Davis had to create a government from nothing. Both of them had knowledge of what had gone on before Davis, had even been an important official in the old United States government. And in the Washington's case, there had been a government before the Constitution, but still they had to create a government from nothing. And of course, Davis had to do it in the midst of a great war, which made his task even more difficult. And having to create this government, Davis also was in the process of trying to help create a nation. This is the first thing I want to talk about. His major task at the outset, and one he recognized, was he had to give an identity and a context to the Confederate States. After all, there had never been a Confederate States before February 1861. There had been Carolinians, Georgians, and Mississippians, and Louisianians, and Texans, and Floridians, Alabamians, but there had been no Confederate States. There had been no nation. How did Davis set about trying to do this? How did he hope he could mold these people together? What kind of common thread could he find? He set the tone in his inaugural address as provisional president. He identified Confederates as heirs of the American Revolution, as descendants of the founding fathers. Confederates were fighting for liberty against oppression and tyranny of the North. He equated the North with England. He equated the Confederacy with the America of the Revolution. In this inaugural address, two dates appear, 1776 and 1789. Looking at the Confederate Constitution, Davis said, the Constitution formed by our fathers is that of the Confederate States. He said, Confederates labored to preserve the government of our fathers in its spirit. And as he closed that inaugural, I quote, reverently, let us invoke the God of our fathers to guide and protect us in our efforts to perpetuate the principles which, by his blessing, they, our fathers, were able to vindicate, establish, and transmit to their posterity the joy of liberty, which, of course, he went on to say is what the Confederacy was all about. Throughout the war, Davis insisted that faithfulness to the founders, faithfulness to the principles they used to create the United States, and which he and his fellow Confederates were using to create the Confederate States, that kind of faithfulness would assure eventual triumph. Even in late 1864 and 1865, when things were going very, very bad for Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy, Davis would point to the bleak years of the American Revolution. And he said, virtue and right triumphed then. Virtue and right can still triumph now. From beginning to end, Confederates were simply sons and daughters of the American Revolution. That is the identity that Davis tried to give his people who had no identity. A second issue that Davis had to address, very similar to this question of identity, and it's one that historians have spilled lots of ink writing about, is the question of Confederate nationalism. Was there Confederate nationalism? Was there Southern nationalism in 1861? Did a Confederate nationalism exist in 1861? Did one exist in 1864? Was there ever one? Well, for Davis, this was no topic for scholarly debates or articles. This was no topic for people to come together and talk about and have a drink over. For Davis, this was life and death. And decisions he made were based on his perception of what he saw out there and what he knew. After all, Davis didn't drop out of the skies in February 1861. He had been a congressman, a senator, and a cabinet officer. He had been a prominent player in national politics for a decade and a half. He understood what America was. He understood the states that had left the United States to make up the Confederacy. And Davis realized in 1861 that there was no Confederate nationalism at all. That's what he was trying to connect Confederates to the Revolution for. Davis saw American nationalism as growing out of the Revolutionary War. Thus, Confederate nationalism would somehow follow suit and come out of the Civil War, come out of the cauldron of this war. Now, Davis reacted in very concrete fashion to this recognition about nationalism. He moved in specific military measures dealing with his conduct of the war. For example, in 1861, he insisted that Confederate armies brigade troops by states. That is, you'd have a brigade, you start off with regiments, then you have a brigade. Then division comes and corps and army and such. But brigades. You make brigades, put all state regiments together. Now, why is this? Does he think Jimmy and Charlie and neighbors are going to like each other better? That's not the point for him. He wrote to one of his generals and he says, the brigading of troops by states is a consequence of the absence of any national character in our confederation, and the fact that state pride is the highest incentive for gallant and faithful service. He knew he didn't have a nationalism. He knew he had to try as best he could to massage, to try to shape, and to foster the growth of such a nationalism. A second example, Davis talked about the military principle of concentration in terms of Confederate nationalism or the lack thereof. The military principle is you should concentrate your forces so you have a better chance of beating the enemy. Davis wrote to his general who commanded in that far-flung trans-Mississippi region out there west of the Mississippi, the vastness of western Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. He wrote at the end of 1863. Now, this is the end of 1863. He says, the general truth that power is increased by the concentration of an army is under our peculiar circumstances subject to modification. The evacuation of any portion of territory, he wrote, involves not only the loss of supplies, but in every instance has been attended by a greater or less loss of troops. In other words, the soldiers have a higher allegiance than to the Confederacy. The soldiers' allegiance is to their state. If we don't defend it, if there's not a visible, tangible Confederate presence, it's going to disappear. After the war, he touched on this same point in a letter to one of his former aides. He wrote, it was the fate of the administration to be considered able to defend every assailed place and to be criticized by everyone who saw but one of the many places to be covered. It was easy, Davis said, to say other places were less important. And it was a frequent plea. Then Davis went on, if it had been heeded, as advised. In other words, if I had done what I had been advised to do and pulled troops away from some places to defend others, he said, listen, notice the litany of words that come. Should I use litany to announce what I mean? Dissatisfaction, distress, desertions, opposition of state governments. All of these would have soon changed apathy into collapse. Now, this is at the end of 1863. Davis still understands that he's leading an inchoate country, that there is no guaranteed combination of loyalty to the central government. What he always believed that somehow the war was going to pull everything together. Not yet by the end of 1863, clearly, but he still hoped it was in the process of happening. Early that year, he had made a public speech in Richmond. And to his audience, he said that war is an evil. He said, war is an evil in every form in which it can be presented, but it has its palliating circumstances. Now, what could be good about war? If he says war is an evil in every form, notice again he's going back to the American Revolution, which is his touchstone as he sees the Confederacy. He says the war is a severe crucible in which we are being tested to submit us together. He used words like sacrifices, words like glory, and what's going to happen. Come back to Shakespeare, says, war will make us a band of brothers, and I trust we will be united forever. Now, Davis, before 1861, had been a quite successful politician. He was a veteran politician. Davis understood that in a democratic polity, leaders didn't make policy in some closed-door room and then issue some kind of ukases and everything was carried out. Davis believed that for a leader to be successful, a leader had to find ways to convey his sense of what was going on and to convey his answers to questions and to convey his vision to the larger public. And the third thing I want to talk about has to do with this attempt to get his message to his citizens. Now, Davis is usually given really low marks. You talk about Lincoln and Douglass, masters of the language. You read a lot of Davis, and it's kind of turgid. Once in a while, he will strike a real chord, but he is not in the league of Douglass and Lincoln in terms of mastering the language, rhetorically mastering the language. But he knew it was important to do that, to get the best he could from himself and to get it to those people who needed to hear it. He prepared state papers and he wrote public letters, which were printed in newspapers that reached across the Confederacy, printed in pamphlets that were shipped out across the Confederacy. But Davis did more than that. Davis was a man who had dominated Mississippi politics in a retail fashion. He was out shaking hands, traveling dusty roads. He did this for 15 years. He was good at it. He tried to do the same thing as President of the Confederacy. On 3 occasions, he left Richmond and he went west. First 2 times all the way to Mississippi. The last time only to Alabama. Each of these 3 occasions was prompted in part by military demands. He wanted to go see his major Western Army. He wanted to talk to generals. He wanted to try to build up morale in his armed forces. But there was more to it than simply going to visit the army. In the winter of 62, 63, in the fall of 1863, and finally in the fall of 1864, in these 3 journeys, while he visited the armies on each occasion, Davis also met with civil leaders. He made major public addresses, and he made numerous impromptu addresses. Railroad stops. Every time the train stopped, he'd come on the back car, step off, and make a brief talk to whoever appeared. And he mingled with voters, as he had learned to do many years before. As one eyewitness to a speech he made in Charleston, South Carolina in 1863, this person said, Davis gave many hands a hearty shake. And I quote, meeting everyone as if he had met an old friend. This was a seasoned politician doing what he knew how to do, trying to get his message about the Confederacy and for the Confederate future and for Confederate hope to all of his people. All of his people. That leads me to the last thing I want to talk about. The blacks in the South, the slaves. Davis would have thought of the slaves as his people only in that particular way that white antebellum Southerners thought of people and slaves. White Southerners before the Civil War rarely used the harsh term slave. You don't often see it. They used servants, and they talked about my people all the time. The slaves are part of the family, as the white South saw it. And my people, those I own, as well as my blood relatives, my wife, my children, my parents, my relatives, my slaves are all my people. Of course, Davis was not trying to convince slaves about the virtue of the Confederate cause. Davis was speaking to white people. And yet, African Americans were never very far from Davis's mind. After all, the Confederate States of America was founded in large part to ensure the protection of slavery. Mike Holt has said that in the beginning Abraham Lincoln had no intention to touch slavery, and that is certainly true. I fully agree. But many of these Southerners were afraid that somehow he would, that his election meant that in some way slavery was fundamentally endangered. Davis was both foursquare behind slavery and foursquare behind the Confederates' commitment to slavery. At the outset, he spoke about Confederates as being unified, notice this phrase, in what he called the identity of domestic institutions. And by that he doesn't mean marriage and children. By that he means slavery. That Confederates in part are identified in their unity about our domestic institutions. Whereas before in the old United States, there was great conflict about this domestic institution. And when the war began, Davis assumed that slaves would labor effectively on farms and plantations and in factories to keep the Confederate productive engine going, just as the slaves had labored before 1860 to keep the productive engine of the southern states going. Now, slaves did it from the start, of course, produce many of the crops and help produce many of the manufactured goods that went to the Confederate Army. In this sense, they aided the Confederate cause from the very start. But early on, they even made more direct contributions because they were called upon to work on things like fortifications, to become teamsters. Initially, this was voluntary. Slave owners would volunteer their slaves to help military units in local neighborhoods to construct fortifications, etc. But early on, the military turned to impressment. That is, they would simply go to a slave owner and say, look, we're going to take so many of your slaves, we're going to put them to work over here. On a military matter, gain fortifications. In 1863, the Confederate Congress legalized this impressment of slaves by the military. But as the war progressed, Davis progressed also in terms of the way he looked at black Confederates. Now, Davis, when he faced the Emancipation Proclamation, Davis was outraged. He saw the Emancipation Proclamation as a barbaric act of bestial enemies because he saw it as a call for race war, as a call for slaves to rise against masters and murder them. And he said so in no uncertain terms. But by the time you get to November 1864, Davis is looking at things a bit differently. In a message to Congress in 1864, and his annual message, he spends some time talking about the question of slaves, and he notices that Congress had authorized this impressment. It authorized the Confederate government to impress slaves, but he says now he thinks that's not going very well. What he wants the Congress to do is to authorize the Confederate government to purchase slaves, that the government itself would own slaves, and then the government would put these slaves to work in the military manner. Fortification, teamsters, hospitals, cooks, etc. Not soldiers. Not soldiers. Because Davis specifically says in this message, we don't need that yet. We have plenty of white Confederates who can fight. But we need these slaves to do these auxiliary tasks so we can turn more of our regular white people into soldiers. That's a big step. Davis wasn't through. He said, should the Congress, in looking at this, decide it might be wise to offer an incentive for faithful service and think about emancipation, Davis said he was ready to join the Congress in offering emancipation for those slaves that the Confederacy would purchase, and then they would serve faithfully and effectively for the war. This is in November of 1864. 3 months later, Davis has taken the final step. February of 1865, he is calling for slave soldiers. He writes to a friend in February of 1865, and he says, look, there's only one question about slave soldiers. Whose side are they going to fight on? He says they're already fighting on the Union side. Of course, by then, there are tens of thousands of former slaves in the United States Army. Davis says it behooves us to get them in our army, because if we don't, they're going to be in the other army. Of course, this is a terribly contentious matter in the Confederacy and in the Confederate Congress. And Davis's advocation of this wouldn't have done by itself. He got tremendous help on this issue from Robert E. Lee, who also said that Confederates had to have slave soldiers if the Confederacy were to survive. Even so, the congressional vote to authorize slave soldiers passed by the narrowest of margins. The narrowest of margins. And in fact, it only passed after the Virginia General Assembly instructed its two senators to vote yes. Initially, they voted no. So in March of 1865, the Confederate Congress did pass a law saying that slaves could be put in the Confederate Army. And this law said nothing specific about emancipation. If it had, it would never have passed. But in the regulations that the War Department was drawing up to govern these slave soldiers, emancipation was certainly there. And Jefferson Davis made commitments about emancipating these slave soldiers that are really astounding in terms of the polity he came from and in terms of the social, economic, and legal system that had always been a part of the United States and was certainly a part of the Confederate States. Davis committed that if these slave soldiers served faithfully, they would be emancipated. But not only that, they could go back to their home farms and plantations. Now, what kind of society is he envisioning? You could have on a given farm or plantation these freed African Americans, emancipated because of service in the Confederate Army. Next to them will still be enslaved African Americans, and next to them, the white owners of the enslaved African Americans, the former owners of the emancipated slave soldiers, and the owners of the land still. That is an enormous leap. Now, this, of course, never occurred. Only a handful of slaves ever became Confederate soldiers, and the destruction of the Confederacy ensured a quite different post-war landscape. But Davis was willing to go this far. Now, closing, how do you evaluate Davis? Well, I haven't talked at all specifically about Davis as a military leader, as a military commander-in-chief. That's so often what people talk about. I chose not to do that in the allotted time that I had here this evening. I would submit to you that I think Jefferson Davis was quite perceptive about the crises confronting his country. He also realized that change became absolutely essential, at times wrenching, almost unthinking change. But if his country were to survive, if the Confederate States were to hold on, he thought this kind of change had to come. I think he made a valiant effort to deal with the fundamental questions facing his country, and I think he coped pretty damn well with this kind of change. But of course, both he and his cause were utterly and totally overwhelmed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know if this microphone has healed itself. Maybe it seems to be doing okay. I want to thank our panelists. Any of you who have been around the academic world know that different academic disciplines have their own kind of culture, their own way of dealing with things. And the historians are always eloquent, learned, animated. I said eloquent. They know the power of language. However, if you give them 15 minutes, you know that they will. Historians, 15 minutes, they can't even get warmed up in 15 minutes. It's kind of like asking a thoroughbred horse to take a 5-year-old on a little 10-second ride around a car. I mean, but we're the better for it, and we thank you very, very much. I have 2 quick comments, then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. Throughout this year so far, the Jefferson School has been looking at this question of leadership in crisis, and there were 2 themes that have been talked about throughout the year that I think came out in the comments here quite pointedly. One is the definition of the problem, the definition of the system, or the situation in times of crisis, and the way we look to leaders to define the situation, or at least to lead the process by which we all come to a collective understanding of what that crisis means or what that situation is. And finally, leading us to a position of common purpose and action. The second point that I think comes out here that we've been thinking about throughout the year is the ways in which leaders use the levers of power available to them. Of course, leaders sometimes, not all the time, have formal powers. And we know Lincoln and Davis had certain formal powers. Douglass, of course, did not. But that is the point that I think has come out in talking about all three of these leaders. The moral authority, the resort in times of crisis to, and appeals to moral language, the capacity to persuade, of course, the ability, as Professor Holt said, to communicate to a hostile audience, and the capacity to place events in a larger moral context. Certainly Frederick Douglass, Lincoln, and Davis, all in their own way, tried to help us understand the situation in the context of larger principles. There are a few other points that may come out in the questions and answers, but let me turn it over to you now. We'll have time for a few questions and answers. We won't shut the lights off, I don't think, on us. So let's hear. I would ask you in presenting your question, if you are a historian, to make it concise, and because we'll get historian answers to it.
We'll work on that.
Okay.
My name is Frank Brown, and my wife, after listening to some of my expositions, says I should be a historian, but I'm in fact not. Dr. Holt, a question for you. Suppose you're right that Lincoln should have placed the Union ahead of the party in 1860, and he had a conciliatory attitude toward southern states, especially regarding the formation of his cabinet. How would 1861 have been different? How would 1865? How would 1875? How would 1898? How would 1954 have been different as a result of his having done that?
I don't think slavery would have ended till the 1930s. It took that war to get rid of slavery. And that would have been the big difference. I don't think there would have been a war. And therefore, you wouldn't have gotten rid of slavery. That's the simplest way I can answer that.
Dr. Holt.
Have you ever seen the Thomas Nast cartoon with the people pointing at you?
You stated that after the beginning of the war, Lincoln put party second and the Union first. In 1864, it was a re-election year, and early on, spring, it looked like it was going to be a tough battle. McClellan was thought by many that he would be the next president. There were 6 states in opposition in the Union, the hotbed being New York, and the hotbed there being New York City. The draft riots occurred, and Lincoln aggressively sent troops into the city to embarrass the party. My question to you, sir, did he use excessive force, and was it for political motivation?
Actually, I think he handled that pretty skillfully. The draft riots, of course, were in the summer of 1863, not in the summer of 1864. And he had a decision about which troops to send, and he sent some militia that had been sent towards Gettysburg. The draft riots occurred within a week of Gettysburg. And some New York regiments, but they were all New York troops. None of them were outsider, and they were in the command of John A. Dix, who was a prominent pre-war Democrat never became a Republican, in order to be as inoffensive towards the local Democratic Party as possible. One can think of a lot worse choices, I suppose. Something John Pope or Ben Butler or something as head of those troops. So I think he handled that as well as he can. I mean, it was clear the local authorities couldn't control the rioting. One of the interesting things about that, there's a wonderful book on the New York draft riots by an historian named Ivor Bernstein, is that the response of the local Democratic machine and Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, he sort of gets this. Tammany stressed their loyalty to the Union. There was a rival Mozart Hall, Fernando Wood organization that were all Copperheads, but what they did after that is that the city government, urged by Tweed, immediately began to sell bonds. And the purpose of this bonds, of course, was to raise enough public money to provide drafted soldiers the $300 commutation fee they need so they'd never have to serve, and this became the basis of Tweed's machine.
Over here? Yeah, Judge Yates. Okay.
I'd like to ask Dr. Blight, so he won't be slighted.
Hey, it's okay.
Why did Frederick Douglass go to the first meeting of the women's movement at Seneca Falls? And secondly, would you comment on why he was so opposed to any kind of reunification of the country after the Civil War?
Well, he went to Seneca Falls because he had a lot of good friends in the women's rights movement who, in part, put his feet to the fire, said, Frederick, you ought to be here. He also went because he believed in it. He'd been a major spokesman of women's suffrage for a decade by then. By 1854, he was on record in favor of women's rights many times over. Had said so in editorials in his own newspaper since 1847. The second question was, why was he so against national reconciliation after the war? Well, Douglass was not against reunion and reconciliation as long as it had, or if it had preserved the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and the civil rights legislation of Reconstruction. He begins to be deeply concerned over reconciliation as early as, well, in the wake of the 1868 election. He's concerned about it as early as 1870. He's deeply concerned about it as he sees the redemption of the southern states in the 1870s, because he sees before his eyes already that an exit, a retreat by the North and by the federal government from any level of enforcement of Reconstruction legislation in the South on the ground was going to leave the freed people essentially helpless. He's also deeply disturbed and animated, as many others like him were, by the sheer scale of Ku Klux Klan violence and other organizations that modeled the Klan from 1868 on. You only had to have your eyes open and read some newspapers to know that blacks were being murdered and intimidated, and that their rights were being brutally violated across the South as early as the 1868 election, and then again in the 1870 elections, such that by the middle of the 1870s, Douglass, for example, makes a speech in 1875. It's a 4th of July speech, and he's anticipating the U.S. centennial the next year, 1876. And he worries out loud in that 1875 speech. He says if in effect, I'm not quoting here, I'm paraphrasing, he says if war among the whites, the Civil War, brought freedom, liberty, and rights to my people, the black people, He says, then, what will peace among the whites bring? And he's greatly worried because he's watching this process now of the resurgence of white supremacy in American political culture. And then eventually, by the later 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, Douglass is watching a federal legal retreat from enforcement. The 1883, for example, Supreme Court decision, the civil rights cases of 1883, was a terrible blow to civil liberties of blacks. And Douglass was, frankly, in despair in 1883. The speech he makes in the wake of that civil rights case, as it's called, cases, from the Supreme Court in 83, is a speech almost identical to the speech he gave after the Dred Scott decision. Because it seemed like it was a return to an America of the Dred Scott decision, saying that in essence, black people had no rights in America. The civil rights cases of 1883 were basically, there were several cases brought to the Supreme Court about equal access to accommodations, hotels, transportation, and so forth. The same kinds of things we're so accustomed to hearing about in the 20th century. He was also, to be quite honest, he found it personally offensive, to be honest, at the way in which Confederate leaders were being honored as national heroes. And he says this earlier. He can't stand the way Robert E. Lee was being celebrated after his death in 1870. And he believes that the lost cause as an ideology and as a tradition is beginning to, in the 80s and 90s, to sort of win these battles over the cultural memory, the political memory, if you like, of what the war had even meant. And I think if you think about it, in Douglass's life, Douglass is in his 40s at the time of the Civil War, right? Escapes from slavery when he's 20 years old. He's in his 40s at the time of the Civil War. Unlike so many great activist leaders, if we think about it, he actually lives to see his cause triumph. A cause he really didn't believe he'd ever see in his lifetime. A sanctioned war to destroy slavery and create civil and political rights and liberty for black people. If you asked him that in 1854 or 57, would he live to see this? He'd have probably said, no, but I'll fight for it. You know? He lives to see it. And then he lives 30 more years to watch it all but dissolve. So his hostility to, if you read my book on this, his own hostility to the spirit of reunion and reconciliation is born of on one level, personal experience, and on another level, a sort of ideological point of view.
We go right in the middle in the back there.
Does this work? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This question's for Dr. Cooper. I'll preface my question by saying I read your biography standing in my swimming pool last summer.
Well, at least you didn't drop it in the water.
Everyone that came by always asked me, why are you reading about him? And I would ask, what do you know about him? But my question is, given Jefferson Davis's West Point background and his service in the Senate, speculate on his national career if he'd have been at a different time, at a different place.
Well, it's hard to speculate at a different time or a different place. I think you can speculate about his time and place. Davis had a national reputation. If, in fact, something had happened in 1860-61 and some sort of deal had been made, that the Union hadn't been dissolved, Davis had a bright political future. You know, leading up to the Democratic Convention of 1860, one person who advocated Davis for president was Benjamin Butler, who was in Massachusetts. Davis had a large following in the North. He was looked upon as a national figure. He was not looked upon as a hothead, as a firebrand, fire eater as they were called. And I think if things had gone differently in 60-61, Davis had a substantial possibility of getting all the way to the White House.
Yeah, maybe one more question, also back there. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to know what happened in 1863 that changed the way Abraham Lincoln thought, the way that Jefferson Jefferson Davis thought and the way that Frederick Douglass thought? What was the catalyst? What was the condition that made them to agree to first say, allow slaves to write in the Union Army, to have those slaves do the work from Congress